I'm in the oddest place in the world to do an interview, which is a cruise ship, which is docked somewhere off of St. Thomas. I'm Michael Steinman from Jazz Lives, if you have no idea. I'm sitting across from one of my dear friends and real heroes, a fellow named Clint Baker. And we're doing this interview today to talk about a school of trombone players who don't get the attention they deserve. And this started because I asked Clint about Sandy Williams. And the reason I asked Clint about Sandy Williams is, heaven help us, that's the guy he sounds like really beautifully. And jazz has a star system, so everybody talks with justification about Jack Teagarden, and the hipper people talk about Miff Mole. But very few people talk about the African-American New York trombonists who came up in the 20s. And Clint knows more about this than I ever will, so he is very happy to share. Thank you, Clint.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me. I feel like a superstar today.
You've always been one.
Sitting here at St. Thomas, across from the microphone, on the Jazz Lives blog. This is cool.
Yeah.
So where shall we start? Do we start at the as they say, should we start at the very beginning? Or do you have any sort of specific questions you want to check in on?
You have this awareness of a school of players who, if there was what I'm going to call a symphonic, legit, clean style, they were the, forgive me, people out there, they were the black antithesis. They were soulful and energetic. And you say, for you, this starts with Charlie Irvis?
Yeah, I think Charlie Irvis is the first to really happen in trombone player in the New York school of playing. For those of you who aren't familiar with Charlie Irvis, his first records of note are with Clarence Williams and the Blue Five and all of the different groups he had. And the particular one's Louis Armstrong. He's the trombonist on Cakewalking Babies, on I don't know, any number of those tunes. Pickin' on My Baby. He was the trombonist of choice for Clarence Williams on those things. Now, one of the things that's really important to understand about Irvis is Irvis also was one of the guys who also worked for Duke Ellington early on, and he was one of the guys who originated the jungle music sound by using mutes. But Irvis was really the first really hot African-American trombone player to really make records. Although when Gunther Schuller spoke about those sessions later in his book Early Jazz, he had negative things to say about Charlie Irvis, which were unfair because Irvis was one of the finest. Irvis had a long career that included playing with Jello Roll Morton. He's on many Jello Roll Morton records, and with King Oliver. In fact, it's kind of bookends of the decade. He's on some of the early records with Clarence Williams, Louis, and Bechet, and he kind of closes the decade with King Oliver's band, the New York Victor sessions. And he had a really strong sound. What characterizes these guys' sound is kind of a strength of sound and a dexterity and a vocabulary that's different from the New Orleans style of Kid Ory, say, or Roy Palmer. It seems to me from my research of New Orleans trombonists, which is another big love, is that there is a very distinct style model that the trombonists came up with. Roy Palmer and Kid Ory are two of the best examples of that. They both play what we call tailgate, which I kind of hate that term, but it's more of a syncopated bass line style of playing. The vocabulary of the trombonists in the New York style is a little different. It's a little bit more like Henri Dutre, who was also the earliest trombonist, where they would make parts up that weren't necessarily rhythmic parts. They were more tenor lines as opposed to bass lines. And this is pretty basic stuff, but it's just to kind of make a differentiation. Always thinking about New York's contributions to jazz, one must always think about particularly with the African American world, is that there was a level of virtuosity in New York came from years of training, like with the Clef Club, Jim Europe's bands. Jim Reese Europe was a huge influence, and he encouraged a lot of African American musicians and gave them work. And I think he encouraged a high level of facility. And I think that's something people don't really think about too much and don't really acknowledge because, like you said at the beginning, Michael, that trombonists like Miff Mole and Bill Rank and those guys are known more, and Jack Teagarden are all known as more virtuoso type players. But there was definitely great skills shown on those early with those African American trombones. I think as much as Irvis was kind of their first, a man who deserves a lot of credit in that school. Of course, none of these guys are actually from New York, except for Benny Morton. He was actually born in New York. But the other guy who looms large stylistically was Charlie Green. Now, Charlie Green was the great trombonist who is most famous for backing Bessie Smith, being Bessie Smith's favorite. I think she said he was her favorite accompanist. He was from Omaha, Nebraska, and that's kind of a crazy place. If you think about what Omaha, Nebraska would have been in the 1890s and early 1900s, it was basically the prairie. And the question was asked to Charlie Green at some point in his career, where did you learn to play jazz? He said, you're not from a jazz town exactly. And he says, well, I went to hear holy roller churches. And I listened to the preacher in the congregation, and that's how he said they would thump. The whole room would be thumping, and that's how he learned. And if you listen to particularly Charlie Green's work particularly with Fletcher Henderson's band, the thing about Fletcher Henderson's band that's kind of weird is it was a dichotomy. There were two bands in one band. On one hand, he was trying to be as he would say, the Black Paul Whiteman in New York, and trying to get all the society jobs. And on the other hand, he would incorporate hot jazz arrangements, and then he would go out and work for the dime labels, like I think Variety or whatever the one, Varsity or one of those labels. And he had his band called the Dixie Syncopators. Harmony, that's right. But I got the Dime Store label part on the Harmony things. And his solo work on the Dixie the Dixie Stompers, that's the band, was astonishing. And one of the great examples of that is Clap Your Hands, Here Comes Charlie, of all things. I think that Fletcher gave him a little extra space because it was his namesake tune. If you listen to his solo on that, it really sounds like a preacher calling his flock. He really had that. He had the shouting trombone thing way before anybody even knew what that was. He also was a great virtuoso trombonist and had an amazing sound. And his sound, his tone, for me as a trombonist, the thing that pulls me in isn't virtuosity, it's tone, presence of sound, the bigness of the sound, the way that sound, the warmth of it, the way it's manipulated to draw expression is all I really care about. I've always, playing fast or playing with dexterity it's good to be able to do, like Charlie Green could do. But his ability to make phrases he was basically playing riff solos that sound like they could be responded to by a congregation. So that was a truth from an interview that actually follows on his recordings. He also incorporated a lot of interesting expression devices. And I think a lot of that comes from playing with Louis, because Louis Armstrong had joined the Fletcher Henderson band in sometime in 1924. And I think that a lot of the guys in that Fletcher band really picked up on Louis' stuff. Although I do think that even Charlie Green was doing a lot of his kind of interesting freak trombone style stuff earlier than that. The thing that you really hear that starts creeping into the vocabulary is the thing called a lip trill terminal vibrato. So with jaw vibrato, and this is an important point. A lot of the early trombonists did not use a slide vibrato. That was more of came about more during the swing era, section playing and stuff. It was more controlled. The older guys used jaw vibrato, which goes back to the days of Arthur Pryor and the proper old band style technique, the brass bands and concert bands. When those soloists would use, like Arthur Pryor used jaw vibrato. And a lot of the players of the 1920s, their model really was Arthur Pryor. I'm sure every trombonist worth his salt had heard Arthur Pryor records. Now, he was the great virtuoso who worked with Sousa's band around 1900. His virtuosity is so astonishing that it almost leaves us to think, what is the trombonist to do? He could do things, I can't do them. I would demonstrate them if I could, that are mind-bogglingly fast. He could play at great speed, but he had great expression. So when I hear everybody from like maybe Andre Dutre to Charlie Green, what I'm hearing is a hotted up version of what Arthur Pryor and what proper band trombonists were doing when they would have a solo opportunity.
I'm going to interrupt here with
Yes.
something that's even relevant.
Yes.
Dan Morgenstern asked Vic Dickinson
Yeah.
where his awareness came from, and Vic had a small record collection, and Dan says he pulled out an ancient 78 of Pryor playing Adeste Fidelis, which I think is O Come All Ye Faithful,
Yeah.
and played it for Dan and pointed to that. So
Yeah.
I think that's...
Oh, it's completely legit. It's a really interesting conundrum that I've considered a lot and spoken with other trombonists. Is if you were a young trombonist in the pre-jazz era, which these guys basically were. I mean, it really wasn't until 1917 until there were records, and a lot of these guys were late teenagers. Their model, like even with Lawrence Brown, Lawrence Brown performed Arthur Pryor solos in his youth because his father was a preacher. And he had to do, sanctified stuff for his father. So he had a knowledge of the Arthur Pryor vocabulary. Let's call it a vocabulary of virtuoso devices and skills. And when you, for example, not to digress, but you get to Lawrence Brown, all you need to do is listen to his solo from the Fargo 1940 Fargo concert on Sheik of Araby, and you can hear all the Arthur Pryor stuff, and it's all combined with hot jazz and speed, because Arthur Pryor could project his sound, because those guys in those days there was no microphones, so it was called buzz. They could make a sound that buzzed, and that it had a projection, and part of that projection was a buzz, a sound, and Lawrence Brown, all these guys I'm talking about had that sound. I always call it the dance. This is my own thing, the dance hall sound, which is that you didn't necessarily expect you were going to have a PA system, but that wasn't even a thing until 1929, late 20s, and they wouldn't have been very good, and they wouldn't have been for the horn players. They would have been for the singers and all that kind of stuff. I mean, for like Bing Crosby, and Russ Columbo and Mildred Bailey were the first people to really use the microphone. You don't really hear about it as instrumental technique until 1935, 36. It wasn't a big deal. In the instrumentals world, you said to be able to project your sound, but those devices, Arthur Pryor could project a sound, and you hear that with Lawrence Brown playing on this Fargo concert. It's clear. Now he did the same solo on the commercial recording, but it doesn't have the same hotness, because it's clear that when he's performing this thing in Fargo, he's out without a microphone. He's like just putting the sound out, and he's playing at extreme velocity, but he's also projecting, and there's a lot of sound there. So Pryor looms large in all trombonists, and it's almost the conundrum I was with me was like, if you're a trombonist and you have to deal with Arthur Pryor, he's done everything you could do on the trombone. So where do you go from there? Well, the next place would be jazz, which is cool. Also, I think it's important to bring particularly Myth Mole into the conversation, because I think that a lot of the New York trombonists did admire Myth Mole, and many of them, he was kind of a hero even to the African American trombonists of the of the 20s. I think also because he was on record pretty early. Do you know when he was first on record, Michael?
I'm going to guess and say 1922.
Yeah, so
whether
that's-
he's with Lannon's Southern Syncopators.
Yeah, I think, and he wasn't with one of those Louisiana Five groups or something like that. He shows up a lot, and he had a really interesting way of kind of playing. He was kind of the first of the jazz trombonists. What I think of, and when I think about the style of like Charlie Green, is they took the elements of the white style, which I think is epitomized by Miff Mole in those days. And they kind of added their own hot music vocabulary to it with taking. I don't think that Miff Mole probably did a lot of lip trills. I don't remember that as being a big part of his style. I think that with Charlie Green, that comes up a lot in his playing. And then to hear Green accompanying Bessie Smith is also an incredibly interesting thing, because it's clear from those records, from everything from Baby Have Pity on Me, where he's playing in the high register very effectively, almost like dare I say, a Tommy Dorsey style before Tommy Dorsey. And then he's playing like the blues, like on Trombone Charlie, or the incredible lick he plays at the end of Empty Bed Blues. He plays like a complete Arthur Pryor, virtuoso, all over the horn lick just to end the tune. And it's like, he was an incredible musician, and I don't think nobody never really talks about Charlie Green anymore. So that's why, so when I play, I try to pay tribute to him every time I play. It's to get the sound. One of the most incredible things that exists on record came up when BMG RCA, thanks to I think our friend Vince was involved in these reissues, when they put out the Louis Armstrong on Victor and RCA, and those recordings from the 30s. Those recordings are incredible. They're with the Chick Webb Band, the particular group I'm thinking about. And there's 2 takes of a tune called Hobo, You Can't Ride This Train. And Charlie Green comes through with some of the most incredible sound, terminal vibrato, and lip trills you've ever heard. And thank God for Ridman microphones, because these were recorded clearly with RCA 44s at the very beginning. And you can hear everything. You can hear the expression, and you can hear the darkness and the richness of Charlie Green's tone, the edge and the darkness of his sound, which it's just like, what was 33?
32, I think.
32, yeah. And it's kind of course, Louis is the best, always, because Louis looms large on all this too, because as much as Miff Mole might have been a hero, Louis just blew it all out of the water for everybody, So, but to have Charlie Green working with Armstrong 8 years earlier, and then coming back and being in that Chick Webb band that recorded with Armstrong is an interesting bookend, and to hear Charlie Green so effectively playing on both takes, it's astonishing. And to hear it like in stereo, like clean.
Let's pause here for a moment.
Okay,